What Armenia did this week crossed a line that diplomats in Brussels, Washington, and Ankara had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Georgia did not hesitate. They responded with speed, resolve, and a clarity of strategic purpose that has stunned observers who had written Tbilisi off as a nation too divided, too dependent, and too exposed to mount a credible response. Tonight, we are going to walk you through everything, how this started, what it means, and what happens next. For nearly 18 months now, there had been signals, not official communiques, not formal intelligence bulletins, just signals, that Armenia was preparing something fundamentally different from its previous posturing along the northern frontier. Armenia has been assertive, yes, but it has been calculated in its assertiveness. Its moves have followed a certain rhythm, a logic, almost a predictable cadence. Provoke slightly, observe the reaction, consolidate, pause, repeat. But what set off alarm bells in Tbilisi and in Western intelligence circles this past month was that the cadence went silent. Regional analysts who monitor Armenian military activity know the indicators. The rotation schedules of mountain infantry units along the Javakheti Plateau, the repositioning of logistics convoys away from the Armenian-Azerbaijani line and toward the northern corridor, the unusual increase in encrypted communications traffic between Yerevan's defense ministry and forward operating bases, the sudden and complete disappearance of routine patrol signals that analysts use as a baseline for normal activity, all of that went quiet. The rotations stopped being logged, the convoys disappeared from satellite imagery, the communication traffic shifted to channels that took longer to analyze. And whenever Armenia goes quiet in the mountains, it means something is about to get very loud in the valleys. Security officials who have tracked this region for decades will tell you, off the record, always off the record, that the most dangerous moment is not when an adversary is making noise. The most dangerous moment is when an adversary that has been making noise suddenly stops. That silence descended approximately 3 weeks ago, and this week it broke. Early Wednesday morning, Georgian Defense Intelligence detected what they described as a coordinated multi-axis ground movement, including the deployment of Armenian special mountain units into elevated positions along the Samtskhe-Javakheti border corridor that had not been activated in over a decade. These are the kinds of assets that Armenia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific, a negotiating ultimatum, a territorial assertion, or a preparation for sustained military pressure designed to force political outcomes. Georgian analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Armenia was changing its operational posture in a way that was not defensive in nature. And when a regional military actor shifts its posture from defensive to offensive positioning without explanation, even by a seemingly small tactical measure, every neighboring capital pays attention. The images coming out of the Javakheti highlands were striking even to the untrained eye. Columns of armored personnel carriers threading through mountain passes that in peacetime carry nothing more than shepherd trails and tourist vehicles, artillery units establishing elevated positions on ridgelines that overlook the roads leading north toward Tbilisi. This wasn't a drill. The Georgians knew it. The Armenians knew the Georgians knew it. And the international community, watching satellite feeds refreshed by the hour, knew it too. By Wednesday afternoon, Georgia's National Security Council had convened an emergency session. By Wednesday evening, the first calls had gone out to allied capitals. And by Thursday morning, Tbilisi was on a war footing that no one in this region had seen in 15 years. The emergency statement issued by Georgia's Ministry of Defense on Thursday was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent in a way that official Georgian statements almost never are, stripped of the usual diplomatic cushioning, direct in a way that told you the people writing it were genuinely alarmed. Source after source at security briefings described Armenia's mountain push as deliberately provocative, operationally advanced beyond what publicly available intelligence had suggested was possible, and perhaps most importantly, timed with a precision that implied external coordination, not unilateral decision-making from Yerevan. Because here is the thing about Armenia's strategy. Pressure only works if the target hesitates. Georgia did not. In fact, Georgia's diplomatic and military response in the 24 hours following the initial incursion was among the fastest and most coordinated mobilizations we have seen from Tbilisi in the modern era. Here is what we know. Within 6 hours of the first confirmed Armenian positions being established on Georgian-adjacent ridgelines, Georgia activated its rapid reaction forces stationed in the Kavimo-Kartli region. These weren't standard patrol units. These were the elite Georgian light infantry, mountain-trained, altitude-acclimated, equipped with NATO standard surveillance and counter-positioning systems that Georgia only deploys when it is preparing for sustained high-altitude engagement. Simultaneously, Georgia's foreign ministry placed calls to the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and Turkey, the four external actors with the most direct stake in South Caucasus stability and the most leverage over the dynamics now unfolding. The calls weren't requests for sympathy. They were requests for action. Tonight, Georgian defense officials confirmed that their rapid reaction forces launched counter-positioning operations across three key elevated zones, including the Salka Plateau, a stretch of high ground that had recently been described by Armenian-linked social media channels as a historically contested zone in what analysts believe was a deliberate information operation designed to pre-justify a territorial claim. Georgia moved before Armenia could consolidate those positions. They secured the northern approach to the Salka Plateau. They established observation and fire control positions on the Abel Samsari Ridge. They pre-positioned forces near the Paravani Lake Corridor, the natural geographic gateway that, if controlled by a hostile force, would give that force a direct line of operational pressure toward the Georgian interior. In other words, Georgia didn't just respond, it targeted the strategic architecture of Armenia's entire pressure campaign, the logistics backbone that would have made sustained Armenian mountain operations viable, the communication nodes that would have allowed Armenian units to coordinate across their dispersed highland positions, the resupply corridors that intelligence suggested had been prepared over the preceding weeks. This is what made Georgia's response so operationally significant. Armenia's mountain push wasn't just symbolic. It was actionable. It represented the kind of territorial pressure that, if left unchecked for even 72 more hours, could have established facts on the ground that would take months or years of diplomacy to undo. And Georgia, understanding that, fully responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with the kind of cold, strategic clarity that comes from a military command that has war-gamed this exact scenario and knows precisely which moves to make and in what order. They didn't strike Armenian population centers. They didn't escalate into internationally recognized Armenian territory. They hit the forward positions. They hit the logistics lines. And here is where the story becomes even more complex. Regional security analysts now believe that Armenia's mountain push was designed specifically to test the cohesion of Georgia's western alignment, to probe whether Tbilisi's partnerships with NATO member states and its aspirational Euro-Atlantic trajectory translate into real, timely support when actual pressure is applied. Armenia wanted to see whether Georgia would hesitate, defer, or reach for dialogue before it reached for defense. But instead, the opposite happened. Georgia didn't wait for a consensus communique from Brussels. Georgia didn't call for a UN Security Council session that would have taken days to convene and produced nothing actionable. Georgia didn't issue a strongly worded diplomatic note asking Armenia to reconsider. Georgia responded with a military counter-positioning so swift, so precisely calibrated, that even Yerevan's most hawkish defense planners were reportedly caught off guard by the speed. You don't catch Armenian military planners off guard easily. They are meticulous. They are patient. They have spent years studying Georgian vulnerabilities and Georgian response timelines. But today, Georgia defied those timelines by a margin that matters. A senior Western defense official speaking with European media under strict anonymity described Armenia's gambit as horizontal escalation, a way of creating pressure on multiple Georgian fronts simultaneously without crossing any single threshold dramatic enough to trigger an automatic Allied response. It is a sophisticated strategy, and it might have worked against a different Georgia. But Georgia proved today that it is neither passive nor predictable. Its counter-operations were not only tactically sound, they were executed with a speed and geographic precision so exact that they appear to have disrupted Armenian coordination timelines before those timelines could reach their second phase. That sequencing matters because it shows something important about Georgian military readiness that many analysts had underestimated. It shows that Georgia is not a reactive nation waiting to absorb blows. It is an active, strategic actor that has apparently spent the last 18 months building exactly the kind of rapid response mountain warfare capability that this moment demanded. As reports continued coming in throughout Thursday evening and into the early hours of Friday, we learned more about the full scale of Georgia's mobilization. Georgian air reconnaissance units carried out extensive drone overflights of the entire Javaketi Plateau, forcing Armenian forward units to either reveal their positions or go dark, either outcome being operationally favorable for Tbilisi. Georgian electronic warfare elements targeted communication relays that had been quietly upgraded in the last 8 months. upgrades that analysts now believe were part of the operational preparation for exactly this kind of push. Georgian special forces operating in the high Samsari range reportedly disrupted 3 separate forward logistics caches used by Armenian mountain units to pre-position supplies for extended elevated operations. This wasn't just a military response. This wasn't just a defensive maneuver. This was a counter-campaign. This was a strategic dismantling of the operational infrastructure Armenia had spent months building in silence. And operational infrastructure is the one thing Armenia has struggled to maintain in the northern corridor since its strategic reorientation following the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War. For every advance Armenia has made in building northern pressure capability, Georgia has countered with something that complicates, degrades, or neutralizes the value of that advance. Tonight's operations were the most dramatic example yet of that counter dynamic playing out at operational scale. Remember, Armenia thought its geographic advantage in the Javakheti highlands would translate into operational dominance over any Georgian response. They thought that altitude, terrain familiarity, and the pre-positioning work of the last 18 months had created a window of pressure that Georgia could not close quickly enough to matter. They thought that the weight of Georgia's domestic political divisions, the ongoing tensions between the ruling Georgian Dream Party and pro-European opposition movements would paralyze Tbilisi's decision-making at the critical moment. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Georgia's political factions, despite their profound domestic disagreements, close ranks around the defense of national territory with a speed and unanimity that surprised even Georgia's closest allies. Georgia's military, despite years of budget constraints and equipment challenges, demonstrated a mountain warfare capability that no external assessment had fully credited. And Georgia's international partners, despite the many doubts about the depth and speed of their commitments, picked up the phone. And more than that, began moving. What makes this moment so consequential and so revealing is that Armenia's mountain push happened at a time when Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan is navigating perhaps the most complex political balancing act of his tenure. The Armenian diaspora in Russia wants a return to Moscow's security umbrella. The Armenian diaspora in France and the United States wants deeper Western integration and European security guarantees. The Armenian military establishment wants resources, validation, and strategic purpose after the humiliation of 2020. And Armenia's domestic population wants security, stability, and some form of national dignity restored after years of geopolitical turbulence. Pashinyan is attempting to balance these demands while simultaneously managing a peace process with Azerbaijan that remains fragile, contested, and deeply unpopular with large segments of the Armenian population. And when leaders in that position make sudden, high-risk moves, they are not doing it from a position of strength. They are doing it from a position of pressure. They are doing it because domestic constituencies are demanding action, any action that signals forward movement and national assertiveness. They are doing it because the political cost of inaction has begun to exceed, in their calculation, the diplomatic cost of provocation. That calculus may have just proven catastrophically wrong. The emergency statement from the NATO Secretary General, now formally distributed to all 32 member state capitals, was designed to signal in the clearest possible terms that the alliance is not willing to allow the South Caucasus to become a theater of unchecked regional military adventurism. Senior alliance officials said plainly that Armenia's forward military positioning along the Georgian border corridor was inconsistent with the principles of peaceful coexistence and territorial integrity that underpin European security architecture. That is diplomatic language for what Armenia is doing is unacceptable, we are watching, and there will be consequences. You do not usually hear that tone from NATO's institutional voice unless something serious enough to affect the broader strategic calculus is genuinely at stake. The statement also notably reaffirmed, in language that was carefully chosen and deliberately pointed, NATO's support for Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity, a reaffirmation that, in the current context, carries weight far beyond its formal diplomatic meaning. It is a signal to Yerevan that Tbilisi is not alone, and it is a signal to Moscow, which many analysts believe has had at least an indirect hand in the timing and nature of Armenia's move, that the West is paying attention and is not about to be caught looking the other way. Meanwhile, Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze addressed the nation in a rare, direct, and remarkably unguarded televised speech on Thursday night. He said, "Georgia will not surrender a single ridge, a single road, or a single stone of its territory to pressure from any direction, by any actor, for any purpose." He said, We have called on our partners not out of weakness, but out of principle, because the rules that protect Georgia's sovereignty are the same rules that protect the sovereignty of every nation in this region and beyond. And he said, to those who believed that Georgia's domestic debates had made us vulnerable, I say tonight, you have misread us. Georgia is united where it matters, and where it matters is here on this ground at this moment. These are not rhetorical flourishes produced by a communications team for domestic consumption. These are statements from a government that understands with full clarity just how high the stakes of this week's events have become, not just for Georgia, but for the entire architecture of South Caucasus security that has been painstakingly imperfectly constructed over the last 2 decades. Here is what makes the situation even more alarming to those watching from regional capitals and Western chancelleries. Armenia's mountain push was not an isolated operation. Along with the primary forward positioning in the Javakheti highlands, pro-Armenian information networks launched a coordinated social media campaign framing the Samtskhe-Javakheti region as an Armenian historical homeland, a narrative operation clearly designed to prepare international public opinion for a potential territorial claim. Irregular groups with documented links to Armenian political factions increased activity in southern Georgia, reportedly conducting low-level destabilization operations targeting infrastructure nodes. Russian state media, operating with a speed and coordination that strongly suggests advanced knowledge, amplified Armenian favorable framing of the crisis within hours of the first reports emerging. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When a state actor moves military, informational, and irregular pieces simultaneously and in coordination, it means something architecturally larger is underway, not an improvised response to local grievances, but a planned multi-domain pressure campaign with defined objectives and a deliberate timeline. The question that intelligence agencies in Washington, London, Paris, and Ankara are urgently trying to answer tonight is, who designed the timeline and why now? Regional analysts are now working through several distinct scenarios for where this goes next. One is that Armenia is preparing a formal territorial claim on the Samtskhe-Javakheti region, a claim it would present to international forums as a negotiated demand rather than a military conquest, using its current forward positions as leverage. Another is that Armenia is attempting to force a comprehensive renegotiation of its strategic relationship with Georgia, extracting economic concessions, transit rights, or political recognition as the price for standing down its forward forces. A third possibility, the one that is worrying Western officials the most in private conversations, is that Armenia is attempting to create a sustained frozen conflict on Georgian territory, a permanent zone of instability that weakens Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, degrades its value as a transit corridor, and keeps Tbilisi permanently distracted and diplomatically compromised. A frozen conflict in Georgia would serve the interests of actors who do not want Georgia to succeed on its western path. It would freeze Georgia's EU accession timeline. It would complicate the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline security guarantees. It would give Moscow leverage over a country it has never fully accepted as beyond its sphere of influence. But today, Georgia took that card off the table. It didn't wait to see which scenario was unfolding. It didn't call for dialogue while Armenian artillery occupied its mountain ridgelines. It didn't issue statements asking for clarification while the strategic clock ran down. Georgia moved decisively, irreversibly, in a way that changed the operational facts on the ground before the political narrative could solidify around them. What we are watching now is a fundamental test of credibility in one of the world's most complex and combustible regions. Armenia wants to see whether its multi-domain pressure campaign can bend Georgian decision-making without triggering the kind of international response that would be strategically costly. Georgia wants to show to its own population, to its partners, and to every actor in this region who has ever doubted its resolve, that it is a functioning, capable, sovereign state that defends its territory without apology and without hesitation. The United States and its NATO partners want to prevent this crisis from becoming the kind of uncontrolled escalation that destabilizes the entire South Caucasus energy and transit architecture at a moment when European energy security is already under severe pressure. And Russia wants to prevent Georgia from demonstrating too convincingly that Western-aligned states can defend themselves effectively. Because that demonstration, if it holds, has implications that extend far beyond the Caucasus Mountains. Every one of these actors is watching tonight, and every one of them will draw conclusions from what happens in the next 48 to 72 hours that will shape their strategies for years to come. Tonight, we have heard from Georgian defense intelligence officials who are now conducting continuous real-time monitoring of Armenian force movements across all identified forward positions. They say Armenian units have not withdrawn, but critically, they have also not advanced further since Georgia's counterpositioning operations were completed on Thursday afternoon. They say the information operation component of Armenia's campaign has intensified in the last 12 hours, suggesting that Yerevan may be recalibrating its approach, shifting emphasis from kinetic pressure to narrative warfare as its military options become more constrained. And they say Armenia's decision to activate its northern corridor forces at this particular moment is almost certainly connected to a broader strategic calculation about the window of opportunity created by Georgia's domestic political turbulence and the West's bandwidth limitations, given simultaneous crises in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. But Georgia is not paralyzed by that calculation. In fact, Georgia appears energized by it. Its response today, surgical in its targeting, swift in its execution, and calibrated in its messaging, sent a message to Armenia that this particular window of opportunity is closed, and it sent a message to every Western capital, every partner government, every skeptical analyst who had wondered whether Georgia had the political will to defend itself. Tbilisi has not only the aspiration, but the capability and the resolve to act when action is required. As this extraordinary week continues, we expect more details to emerge about exactly what Armenia hoped to achieve and what, if anything, it was promised by the external actors who appear to have had foreknowledge of this operation. But what we already know is that Georgia's response was not only timely, it was transformative. It demonstrated that the years of NATO partnership programs, military training, and defense institution building have produced a Georgian armed forces that can actually perform when the moment demands performance. It demonstrated that Georgia's political leadership, despite everything, despite the divisions, despite the protests, despite the international criticism over democratic backsliding, but it retains the capacity for decisive national security decision-making when the country's fundamental interests are at stake. And it demonstrated, perhaps most importantly, that the South Caucasus is not the passive, malleable strategic space that some regional actors appear to have assumed it was. What happens next will depend enormously on what Armenia's leadership decides to do in the next 24 to 48 hours. If Pashinyan chooses to stand down his forward forces and accept a return to the pre-crisis status quo, perhaps with some diplomatic face-saving mechanism, this week will be remembered as a failed gambit that ultimately cost Armenia more credibility and strategic positioning than it gained. If Armenia holds its positions and attempts to escalate further, Georgia and its partners have already demonstrated that they are not only ready to respond, they are prepared to do so with the kind of coordinated multi-domain capability that raises the cost of escalation to a level that rational actors cannot afford. And tonight, for the first time in nearly 2 decades of South Caucasus strategic competition, Armenia appears to be recalculating. Yerevan is quiet, too quiet. And when a government that launched an audacious multi-domain pressure campaign goes quiet within 72 hours of its launch, it means something important has happened in the rooms where decisions are made. It means the expected response did not arrive. It means the assumptions that underpinned the strategy have been disrupted. And it means they are choosing their next move with a care and deliberateness that was not present when the operation was first set in motion. Because tonight, Armenia learned something, not for the first time, but perhaps more clearly than ever before. Geography is not destiny. Elevation is not dominance. And silence before a move is not the same as weakness after it. That a nation's resolve is not measured by the quietness of its days, but by the clarity of its response when those quiet days end. And that Georgia, whatever its internal contradictions, whatever its unfinished democratic journey, whatever the doubts of its critics, is a nation that fights for its ground. This story is far from over. The mountain positions are still occupied. The diplomatic lines are still burning. The international community is still deciding how firmly it is willing to stand behind the principles it professes to defend. But tonight, one thing is unmistakably clear. Georgia did not blink. The international community did not look away. And the South Caucasus, this ancient, volatile, irreplaceable crossroads of civilizations and pipelines and competing imperial ambitions, has reminded the world, once again, that what happens in these mountains does not stay in these mountains. We will be here watching every development, tracking every movement, analyzing every statement as the next phase of this extraordinary crisis unfolds. Stay with us.